Just to let you know a little bit about Dan, he is a primary and secondary educator in Boardman, Ohio. He lives there with his wife, Sarah. He has been a guide, a park ranger at Gettysburg National Military Park. He has an MA in military history, and his undergraduate was in instrumental music. So if anyone wants to hear the Ashokan farewell at the end, Dan may be able to do that. I do not know, but perhaps he'll tell us. He has also studied under Dr. Alan Guelzo as part of the Gettysburg Semester at Gettysburg College. He has a number of books, but for our purposes, he is a prominent historian with the Emerging Civil War Historians Group, and he is the first one, I think, that we've had from that group tonight. And as you can tell, he's a lot younger than most of us. Not all of us, but most of us. I'm looking at you, Jimmy. Okay? And he has a number of books. He has released 4 in the last year. And it will be great to see him, to hear him tonight. We're live streaming. Right, Tommy? Okay. And we will go ahead without further ado. Yes? No, we'll do that afterward because we want to hear Dan, right? Right? Okay, and we'll give out the money later and the picture. But without further ado, Dan Welch.
Well, good evening, everyone. Let me know if you can't hear me. I've had many careers where I've got to use a loud voice, so you folks in YouTube land, you may want to turn down your volume on your computer. I've been a marching band instructor. I work as a park ranger, and I teach elementary kids instruments, so very used to talking loudly. So if you can't hear me, let me know. But before we begin our program tonight, I do want to take a moment to thank Mark and your Roundtable for bringing me up tonight. It's been an interesting year on the Roundtable circuit, last 18 months or so, doing virtual presentations and waiting for the moment to be back in person. So this is my first presentation back in person, done a lot of virtual things, and there's nothing better than being able to spend an evening with other folks that are interested and exciting about this defining moment in American history. And with that, we're going to go ahead and begin our program tonight. We're going to talk a little bit about our state tonight at the Battle of Antietam on September 17th, 1862. It's the single bloodiest day in American military history. 23,000 casualties, north and south, men killed, wounded, gone missing, or captured in just 9 hours of fighting. And tonight we're going to explore several stories of those Ohioans that served at the Battle of Antietam all of those years ago. And as we get towards the end of the program, I'm even going to have a little challenge for you, some research assistance, if you will. But with that, let's go ahead and begin. And before we get these units to Antietam from Ohio, we need to take a step back and spend a moment to understand how Ohio gets into the war effort itself. And exactly what Ohio's contribution is to the Union armies and the federal government during the war. And hopefully you can get a better sense from some of the numbers that we're going to talk about, some of the ways in which Ohio responds to the Lincoln administration's need for men and material and treasure, money if you will. We'll then understand a little bit about why these men's experience at America's single bloodiest day is an important story to tell. So our story then begins on January the 7th of 1861. Just 2 weeks earlier, South Carolina has seceded from the Union. They voted to secede on December 20th of 1860, and now here on January 7th, 1861, at the State House in Columbus, State Senator Richard A. Harrison is going to offer a number of resolutions that will very quickly be adopted by both houses of the state legislature. These resolutions are going to be in direct response to the events that have taken place in Charleston, South Carolina just weeks earlier. In part, Harrison's resolutions would include this, quote, "The people of Ohio believe in the preservation of this government," end quote. And that, quote, "the general government cannot permit the secession of any state without violating the bond and compact of the Union." One of Harrison's final resolutions in this package to go before the state legislature included the following. The power of the national government must be maintained. So in direct response to South Carolina's secession from the Union, Ohio will take a position that secession is unconstitutional, that the United States government, the federal government, the national government must be maintained, and that we need to do whatever steps are necessary to be able to continue to have these United States. But despite this resolution, and both houses will adopt it, despite these early proclamations coming out of Columbus and really positioning the state of Ohio on this idea of the sectional crisis and the constitutionality of being able to secede from the Union, there were still other aspects at this point in the early phases of the American Civil War that Ohioans as citizens and their representatives in Columbus itself are going to agree with the Southerners on. Ohio doesn't immediately transition to an anti-slavery state, a pro-abolition state. They're simply saying in January, 2 weeks after the sectional crisis really opens up, that we believe in the power of the national government and that of the United States. But there are certain things, as I mentioned, that Ohio, in particular at the state level in Columbus, still agrees with the southern states. First one, quote, "The people of Ohio are opposed to the meddling with the internal affairs of other states." Sounds like the argument of states' rights. Another one of the resolutions went so far as to support the fugitive slave law and the repeal of any state laws in Ohio that had been passed in opposition to it being carried out by Ohio citizens. So although Ohio at this point in January of 1861 is pro-government and pro-United States, they are not on the full spectrum yet of opposing what the southern states are discussing as they are leaving the Union. Regardless of that, the senators and representatives in Columbus felt very strongly about these resolutions. Both houses passed it. And not only did they pass it and send it out into the media across the state of Ohio, but they would have copies prepared to be sent to President Buchanan, both the U.S. House of Representatives and Senate, and even the governors of all states of the Union. Now, just 1 month later, in February of 1861, as the sectional crisis is growing, signs of war are becoming more apparent across the country, Ohio is still not ready to commit her sons to a war that may be brewing. They are still under the idea of peace at any cost. And so on February 4th, 1861, Ohio will send a number of delegates to a peace conference that's been called by the Virginia legislature for them to convene in Washington, D.C. The Ohio General Assembly will select 7 prominent Ohioans to go to this meeting on February 4th, 1861. One last chance, one last Hail Mary, one last compromise to avoid this war that seems inevitable. Ultimately, the conference would end in failure. And what would really transition Ohio to a pro-war setting will be the events of April 12th, 1861. When Confederate forces in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina will fire on Fort Sumter. As the Ohio State Senate is in session that day, a senator rushes into the chamber, busts down the doors. He's very winded, hands on his knees. He's breathing in the air, and he's trying to get out a very important statement. Finally, after catching his breath, he yells out above the din of the Senate chamber, quote, "Mr. President, the telegraph announces that the secessionists are bombarding Fort Sumter." The chamber falls silent. No one knows what to say or what to do. And it's in that silent moment that a woman by the name of Abby Kelly Foster, who was in the Senate that day to hear arguments on the expansion of legal rights of married women, will cry out, "Thank God." Within 3 days, on April 15th, 1861, President Lincoln has issued a call for 75,000 volunteers. And the governor of Ohio at this point, a man by the name of William Dennison, will telegraph D.C. and President Lincoln, and he will ask what Ohio's quota will be of that 75,000. The telegraph would read this: what proportion of the 75,000 militia you call do you give Ohio? Dennison would continue his telegraph to Lincoln: we will furnish you the largest number you will receive. There is great rejoicing here over your proclamation. Ohio would receive an initial quota of 13,000 men. And overnight, in the middle of the month of April of 1861, the state of Ohio has transitioned to that war footing. What exactly does Ohio commit to this war effort? In April of 1861, upon Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers, the state of Ohio, in $1861, will spend $2.5 million to arm, equip, and protect the state from invasion in the first weeks of this war. Over the next 4 years, total soldiers from the state of Ohio sent to the front would be 319,189 men. These men would comprise 230 infantry and cavalry regiments, 26 independent batteries of artillery, 5 independent companies of sharpshooters. 3,452 Ohioans will serve in the Navy on gunboats. 5,092 men from the state freedmen will serve in the various branches of the federal armies. Ohio had committed a lot of its sons to war. And at the end of the war in 1865, approximately 10% of those that Ohio sent to the front had become a casualty of that war. 35,475 Ohioans would lose their lives in the American Civil War. 3 out of every 5 male Ohioans between the ages of 18 to 45 would serve. Only Pennsylvania and New York would put more men in the field than the state of Ohio. But with the respect to the proportion of those men comprised of the entire state population among northern states, Ohio led the way. To entice Ohioans to serve, the state made sure that the men in the ranks from Ohio were well compensated. In addition to their regular Army pay and premiums, Ohio would spend, again in 1860 money, $23.5 million on compensation for its veterans. Only 8,750 men would be drafted for service. Ohioans felt a strong call to duty, and very few drafts were necessary in the state. And fewer than 44 Ohioans per 1,000 men would desert. It's an astonishing low rate across the northern states that sent men to fight during the American Civil War. Ohio was committed once the bombardment of Fort Sumter had occurred. And by the time of the Maryland Campaign in the late summer and early fall of 1862, a number of those Ohioans were serving in the Union Army of the Potomac. There would be infantry regiments such as the 8th Ohio, raised largely from our surrounding area this evening. There would be an artillery battery. There would be a number of other infantry regiments from various aspects of the state's call for soldiers. In all, 11 different units from the state will serve at the Battle of Antietam. The 8th Ohio, the 1st Ohio Light Battery L, the 12th, 23rd, 30th Ohio, the 11th, 28th, 36th Ohio, and the 5th, 7th, and 66th Ohio. I want to point out an interesting flag here. One of the things that I set out to do upon the book that I wrote based on this topic is to tell stories and provide images of Ohioans in their service at Antietam, that stories that haven't been told, pictures that haven't been seen. This here is the flag to the 1st Independent Ohio Battery, known as McMullen's Battery. This flag is at the Ohio Historical Society, and that is the flag that was flown during the Battle of Antietam itself. So A pretty interesting thing to see that this evening. So 11 units from the state of Ohio. At all those numbers we heard about Ohio's commitment to this war effort, 11 units will find themselves in the Union Army as it's marching out of the Washington, D.C. defenses in early September of 1862 and making their way off to destiny. Now, for many Ohioans and a number of other states whose units were in the Army of the Potomac, the Antietam campaign will begin on September 3rd of 1862. Specifically to Ohio units in the 12th Corps would kick off the campaign for our state's servicemen by marching from the outskirts of Washington, D.C. towards Tenallytown. And just 2 days later, by September the 5th, they would make their way to Rockville, Maryland. There, another Ohio unit would join up with this long column marching westward out of the defenses of Washington, D.C., the 8th Ohio of the 2nd Corps. Sergeant Thomas Francis Galway of the 8th Ohio would recall this moment as their men were on the march in this most recent campaign. He's going to speak to the glamour of being a soldier in the ranks. He said, quote, "We are very dirty and lousy. The shirts we have on our backs now we have worn for about a month. We all scratch alike, generals and privates. The lice have grown to be a perfect torture to us." Despite the regiment's poor appearance, as they pushed further westward into the heart of Maryland itself, they would receive a hearty welcome from the town's citizens there in Rockville, Maryland, quote, "despite the fact that the rebels have been claiming that Maryland was one of their states and only was waiting to be liberated by them." By September 6th, more Ohio units were on the march, in particular the Kanawha Division, which was attached to the 9th Corps under the command of Ambrose Burnside. An enterprising young officer of the 23rd Ohio, perhaps you heard of him, Rutherford B. Hayes, would write of this moment. He said, "We appeared to be bad advantaged by the side of our troops. Men were lost from their regiment. Officers left their commands to rest in the shade, to feed on fruit. Thousands were straggling, confusion and disorder everywhere." The 23rd Ohio, as part of the Kanawha divisions, this is their first experience with the men of the Army of the Potomac. They'd been fighting in Western Virginia in 1861. And their first real campaign experience with the Army of the Potomac, particularly Rutherford B. Hayes, is not impressed of how these men handled themselves. Nor was Colonel George Crook, the commander of the 36th Ohio, when he attested that the Kanawha Division compared favorably in discipline and general good conduct with the best troops of the Army while in Maryland. It's at this moment that a mild rivalry begins to grow between the Ohioans of the Kanawha Division and these other eastern troops of the celebrated Army of the Potomac. It's a rivalry that will continue long after the end of the American Civil War. But by September 12th, the van of the Army of the Potomac, the Kanawha Division, were in just a day's march of Frederick, Maryland. They'd been marching on a route known as the National Road. And it was later that day, as the lead elements of the Kanawha Division and the Army of the Potomac begin to make their way towards Frederick, that a short and small skirmish will break out. Brigadier General Wade Hampton's Confederate cavalry had been resting outside of Frederick, Maryland itself. They'd been contesting a crossing of the Jug Bridge, a crossing across the Monocacy River on that national road. For the march to continue heading west towards the Confederate Army, to bridge that gap, they needed to have that bridge to get across the Monocacy River. And Wade Hampton's Confederate cavalry contingent was there to contest it. And so a number of men from Ohio were sent in through the town of Frederick out towards that bridge itself to defeat Hampton's cavalry, to send them on their way, and to free up the bridge crossing itself. Selected for one of these units to push forward would be that of a man by the name of Colonel Augustus Moore. Colonel Augustus Moore would be commanding the 2nd Brigade of the Kanawha Division, which comprised the 11th, the 28th, and 36th Ohio. Now, as this small skirmish is developing, as things are happening very, very quickly, Moore's going to get a little frustrated with the progress of events that are taking place, and we'll come back to his story in just a moment. But as the rest of the column is pushing through Frederick, heading west out of town towards that crossing, the citizens of Frederick were elated to see men from Ohio and men from the Union Army and the Army of the Potomac. Much to the chagrin of this story we've been told for the last 150-some years that, the Confederates moved into Maryland to liberate, to throw off the Union yoke of suppression in Maryland, and that Confederate soldiers by the thousands would join Lee's army. But as these Ohioans and men of the Army of the Potomac made their way into Frederick, Maryland, the city opened its doors and windows to welcome its guests. Reverend William Lyle of the 11th Ohio would write of the moment. He said it seemed as if the pent-up loyalty of the citizens burst out everywhere in every form of demonstration. Quickly, the whole city was arrayed in holiday attire. Men laid down in the road saying they couldn't stir again, wrote Lieutenant Colonel Hayes. He said some were pale, some were red, as if apocalyptic. Frederick's enthusiasm for its new liberators summoned all the Ohioans' strength. Quote, half an hour after they fell out, soldiers, they were marching erect and proud and hurrahing for the ladies. Citizens jumped down with happiness. They called the enemy's occupation of their city the longest week of their lives. Then liberated, they were experiencing the happiest hour of their lives. As all this is taking place in Frederick itself, just west of the town at that bridge crossing, there are Ohioans that are going into combat. It's not all fun and games for the Ohioans in the 9th Corps that day. As things are beginning to break out in the skirmish, and Colonel Augustus Moore, this pre-war owner of a Cincinnati bakery, a coffee house, a beer garden, and a veteran of the Second Seminole and Mexican-American Wars, tired with the progress, would ride ahead and push further ahead. Outpacing the rest of those men behind him, Moore would be captured. One of the earliest Ohioans of significant rank to be captured during the campaign. But eventually, the bridge crossing would be captured for Union soldiers. The march westward down the National Road would continue, and by September the 14th, 1862, the men of the Kanawha Division, the men of the 9th Corps, and the other Ohioans of the numerous other corps, the 2nd Corps, the 12th Corps, the 5th Corps, would be back on the march. On the early morning of September the 14th, at about 6 a.m., the Kanawha Division was moving across Catoctin Creek. Their division commander, Jacob Cox, was surprised as they're marching down this road. They're crossing over the creek. They're heading towards a very tall mountain range in front of them and towards a gap through that mountain range. As they're marching, Cox is riding down the road, and he encounters none other than Colonel Augustus Moore that had been captured 2 days earlier. He rides over and he talks to Moore and asks him what happened. And Moore talks about riding ahead, the confusion in the skirmish, getting captured, and that he had been recently paroled by the enemy. And so, as Cox is leading his men westward towards the Confederate Army, towards this gap in this large mountain range, Augustus Moore blurts out, he says, "But where are you going?" Cox replied back to him, "Well, I'm going to support our cavalry down the road here in Turner's Gap." Moore yells out, "My God, be careful." And he stops talking. You see, Moore had been paroled by the Confederate forces. Part of the agreement to that parole is not to tell any of those back in the Union Army what he has seen, what he has been, any sort of tactics or strategy that he has become a part to while being in Confederate hands. So he stopped talking, and he simply started walking eastward down the National Road. As he did so, Cox, the division commander in command of these Ohioans of the Kanawha Division, thought about the very quick and odd exchange between the two. It was from that quick and odd exchange that Jacob Cox was on high alert. Many of the things that he would do to command the Kanawha Division on battle that would erupt later that day would be a direct result of that brief moment he had with the captured Augustus Moore earlier that morning. Now, as we talk about the Battle of South Mountain that will erupt on September 14th, 1862, we are unable to tell all the stories of the Ohioans and their involvement, and they have a significant involvement in the Battle of South Mountain. And it's at this point in time that I tell you that a large number of those stories can be found in my book, right over there on the table. I'd be happy to sign it for you after the program this evening. But tonight we're going to focus on just one story, one representative example, one Ohioan's experience at the Battle of South Mountain. And it'll be the experience of this man, pictured here on the right of your screen, Lieutenant Colonel Rutherford B. Hayes, in command of the 23rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry. Hayes' men and their unit are part of a brigade that is together with another Ohio brigade that makes up the Kanawha Division in the Army's 9th Corps. As that division completes its deployment later that day, at about 9 a.m., about 3 hours after Cox had met Augustus Moore on the road, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes' 23rd Ohio would be placed on the far left of a line that is developing on this now growing battlefield. The brigade of which the 23rd Ohio belonged would have bayonets fixed. The orders have come down the chain of command, and pretty soon they're going to be ordered to attack a North Carolina brigade under the command of Samuel Garland. And you can see this line of soldiers right here. When the orders are finally received, Hayes yells the men into motion. They'll be the first men to move. Hayes' men will get out ahead of the rest of the brigade as they push towards the Confederate line. They'll maneuver through dense trees. They'll maneuver through a farm road in the distance. By Corporal Charles Hayes' watch, 23rd Ohio skirmishers, that advanced warning system that tactics demanded of the day, will have gone into contact with North Carolinians. And Charles Hayes' watch read 8:55 a.m. Now, Hayes would advance his entire regiment into the battle, holding nothing back. As they moved towards the North Carolinians in this fight, his line would become almost inverted. Instead of that line, shoulder to shoulder, straight line, 2 ranks deep, as they were trying to traverse some of this ground. If you've ever been to the South Mountain battlefield, it's a pretty rough piece of terrain to fight a battle. His line is beginning to break. It's almost becoming inverted as they push closer towards the North Carolinians themselves, in particular, the 5th North Carolina of Samuel Garland's brigade. Hayes recorded the advance, leading his men into battle. He said, "We pushed through bushes and rocks over broken ground." The inverted formation that I mentioned and that broken terrain made it difficult for the regiment to keep that shoulder-to-shoulder, 2-rank-deep formation as they pushed towards the North Carolinians. "I feared confusion," Hayes would later write. He said, "So I extorted, swore, and threatened the men in order to keep them in formation." Can you imagine this future president, sword in hand, walking up and down the line, pushing men back into formation, shoulder to shoulder, 2 ranks deep, having them get back into that straight line of combat instead of this inverted V formation? All of that yelling, all of that swearing, all of that exhorting, all of those threats that he made against those privates in the ranks worked. And when the 23rd Ohio crashed into the 5th North Carolina, particularly the right end of their line, it would force the North Carolinians backwards. Now, to be fair to the North Carolinians, it's not all the Ohioans doing that day. A number of North Carolinians in the 5th North Carolina that day were conscripts, and they were experiencing their first battle. But nonetheless, the Ohioans pushed forward the attack. Hayes would not let the 5th North Carolina and the other Confederates on the field that day rest after that first assault on their position. Hayes would very quickly go up and down the line, have the men reform, fill the gaps from the casualties that had occurred during the first attack, and he would order a second assault. As those men are assaulting the 5th North Carolina, he's seeing casualties happen up and down his line. He would later write, "We found we could not stand it long." So if you're out there standing, firing, shoulder to shoulder, only yards apart, and you're sustaining high casualties, what are your options as a commander? Fall back or charge? Hayes would order a second charge that day. His maneuver would work brilliantly. Hayes later wrote, "With such impetuosity did our troops charge on the enemy that they appeared thunderstruck, scarce knowing what to do or which way to go. At a distance of less than 100 yards, Hayes halted his men behind a stone fence," and you might be able to see it right here, behind a stone fence that lined the mountainside. After this second charge, the second assault, the opposing regiments would stand up and fight in a deadly musketry fire back and forth. Hayes was unhappy with the performance of way things were going. His men are standing there, they're trading shot for shot with the men of the 5th North Carolina, but an impasse has occurred. The only results that are being produced are men that have been killed or wounded. And so Hayes at this moment, the Ohioan that he is, makes a decision. If you know anything about Rutherford B. Hayes and the story that I've told you so far, it's not to fall back. Hayes orders a third charge on the enemy line. As soon as Hayes rises up from behind the stone wall, sword in hand, to give the order to charge, he later wrote what happened next. "I felt a stunning blow, and I found a musket ball had struck my left arm just above the elbow." He asked a nearby soldier to tie a handkerchief around it as a makeshift tourniquet to stop the loss of the blood. Hayes tried to continue on with the men, the line surging ahead of him as the inevitable was coming to play. Despite the handkerchief, the loss of blood, Hayes was growing weaker by the moment. And he would eventually lay down behind his line of battle. And there, lying on the battlefield, he would use his ears to monitor the progress of the fight that was taking place. He would send orders to his men in front of him, carrying on this fight from the ground. He would order his left company on the far end of the 23rd Ohio's line to reform, fall back, if you will, to refuse the line, to deal with a new threat that has arrived on the battlefield itself. The company did so. They followed Hayes' orders. But here's where the importance of having a commander on the field, having that firm grip on command and control, is illustrated. When the company fell back, refused their line, they created confusion in the rest of the 23rd Ohio. And what do you think the rest of the 23rd Ohio thought what was happening as they pulled back? A full retreat had been ordered. So the 23rd begins to pull out. And as they make their way back towards where they had started moments earlier, left behind between the two lines of battle is Rutherford B. Hayes. He believed he had laid there for about 15 to 20 minutes. And as he's laying there, near him is a wounded Confederate soldier. He asked the man, in case he did not survive, to hold on to his personal letters and to convey them to his family. And the enemy wounded soldier, this Confederate, promised to do so, and Hayes handed over his personal belongings and letters to the Confederate. Hayes would later write, he said, "We were right jolly and friendly. It was by no means an unpleasant experience, lying there as a wounded man between the lines of battle." Once the fighting had quieted down, it hadn't ended, but although it's quieting on this end of the Ohioans' line, Hayes decided to start calling for help. "Hello, 23rd men, are you going to leave your colonel here for the enemy?" Well, as soon as Hayes calls out, some men attempt to go and get him. They leave the line, they go out heading towards them, but a group of men moving closer towards the enemy thinks another charge is coming, and so they open up. And Hayes recalled that fire was soon raging hotly as ever. Hayes told the men, "Seek cover. Forget about me. Don't try to come and get me." But despite Hayes' calling off of the rescue attempt, two men, one of which would be Lieutenant Benjamin W. Jackson, would dart forward amongst the fire, and he would make his way to Hayes. He would grab Hayes, pull him behind a log, for cover. The battle would continue on. Lieutenant Colonel Augustus Coleman's 11th Ohio, you can see here in the bottom of the screen, would come up to the aid of the 23rd Ohio in its fight. And with their arrival, the full strength of the Kanawha Division was present. And Jacob Cox would order the Ohioans to charge forward towards the Confederate line itself. The 23rd Ohio, now led by a major by the name of James Comley, surged forward yet again. The enemy would open a volley fire on the advancing 23rd, but the men of the 23rd responded before charging forward and initiating a hand-to-hand melee. One soldier of the 23rd recalled what happened next. He said the psalm singers of the Western Reserve, as the 23rd Ohio was nicknamed from the hotbed of abolitionism in the North, had met the boastful champions of wrong and robbery from the hotbed of oppression and treason in the South. But freedom's steel, stronger than slavery's bullets, had signaled triumphantly. The cost of Cox's men, the Ohioans fighting this battle, was high. 324 men in total would become casualties of the battle, a vast majority of them from Hayes's 23rd. Alexander White, a musician from the 23rd Ohio, would be detailed to the medical corps in the aftermath of the battle. He would help carry 88 wounded Ohioans nearly 1 mile to the rear after the battle ended on September the 14th. One of the men he took to the rear for help was Hayes. White would later recall, he said, "I went to him and I offered to help him, but he told me there was plenty worse off than him." Hayes would remain for a brief time before the medical corps would move him further from the front lines. He would then be taken to the home of Jacob Rudy in the town of Middleton, a home that had been selected by the surgeon of the 23rd Ohio, who also happened to be the brother-in-law of Rutherford B. Hayes, his name Joseph Webb. Joseph Webb's brother, James Webb, had arrived to Middletown to aid the wounded Hayes in the days after the battle, as well as Hayes's wife, Lucy. She would arrive there on the 23rd. An Ohio Surgeon General would also arrive to Middletown, a man by the name of Gustav Weber, and he would come to Middletown. He begins to inspect how the care and condition of the wounded Ohioans from the Battle of South Mountain was in the town itself. And he would stop in and see Hayes personally. Now, Gustav Weber, the Ohio Surgeon General, is inspecting Hayes' wounded arm. And according to a post-war recollection, Hayes at this moment told Ohio Surgeon General that he had asked multiple times for his arm to be amputated before the Ohio Surgeon General had arrived. But both James Webb and his brother, his brother-in-law, Joseph Webb, decided we're going to save the limb. We're not going to amputate it. And when Weber finally gets there, looks at Hayes' arm, says, "Your surgeon, your brother-in-law, was right. His arm doesn't need to be amputated." Can you imagine if Hayes had gotten his way? How history would have changed in that moment. Hayes would stay at the Rudy home for 3 more weeks. At the end of the 3 weeks, him and his wife would leave for Ohio on October the 5th of 1862. And during Hayes' stay in the home of the Rudy family, which is still standing in Middletown, his private home, but you can go see it today. During his stay there, Hayes and his wife really became close with the Rudy family and all of their children. And when they left in October of 1862, it didn't end their friendship. Mrs. Rudy would later write, "We fell in love with him directly." Rutherford B. Hayes would return to Middletown in 1864 to visit the Rudy family. Kate Rudy, one of Jacob's daughters, would visit Lucy Hayes several times in Columbus in 1868. And on Election Day in 1876, Jacob Rudy, the man who owned this home in Middletown and opened its doors to Rutherford B. Hayes, who was, quote, very unwell at the time, still went out and voted for Hayes, who would win election as the 19th President of the United States. The elderly Rudy, Jacob, would pass away just weeks later, Christmas of that year. One of Jacob Rudy's sons, who had gotten to know Rutherford during his recovery at their home, would write to Hayes, now President of the United States, telling Hayes of his father's death. Hayes would write back within a week to the family in Middleton. And he wrote, quote, Rudy's son talked about the letter, that it said, quote, "It expressed the utmost sympathy for us all, and reverted kindly to the time when he was disabled and had a home with us. The Battle of South Mountain would not bring the Maryland campaign to a conclusion. Just 3 days later, on September the 17th, 1862, the single bloodiest day in American history would take place on the rolling terrain and farm fields south of the town of Sharpsburg, Maryland. Tonight we're going to look at the story of just 2 Ohioans on that day. Our first from the 8th Ohio, a lieutenant by the name of Azor Nickerson. Our other story I'll save towards the end. I'm sure it's someone you've heard about before. Now, the 8th Ohio Volunteer Infantry would arrive to the vicinity of what would become the battlefield of Antietam on September the 16th of 1862. The position that the 8th Ohio would take and that of their brigade was tactically selected, meaning that it had a purpose, where they were being placed. And that purpose was to support a number of Union artillery, a number of cannons that had been aligned on a ridge line to duel with Confederate artillery in the distance. What role that plays is very irksome to men in the ranks. Think about it. You're an infantry soldier. Your musket, you've got your rifle. You got a max range of maybe 500 yards. You're not hitting anything accurately 500. Maybe 200, 250 yards. And you're ordered to support an artillery battery that's firing at a target a mile away. And guess what that artillery battery does in return on the other side? They send lead back to you, and you're forced to sit there or stand there in the ranks under fire. It's horrible. And Lieutenant Azor Nickerson of the 8th Ohio would say that supporting batteries is always irksome. And when the enemy has found your range and occasionally drops a 10 or 20-pound shell in your ranks, it is both disagreeable and dangerous. First Lieutenant Azor Nickerson is going to recall a very interesting story that would continue to happen as these men would support the artillery battery. And it's a little bit of a lengthy story, and I'm going to read most of it to you this evening. And the reason I'm going to share with you it is because I want you to hear his exact words. Now, I talked a little bit at the beginning of the program of how when South Carolina seceded that Ohio was all about defending the national government and keeping the Union together, but that they weren't very quickly all in favor of violating the rights of other states or doing away with the fugitive slave law. One of the things I often talk to folks about is that during the American Civil War, and particularly after the Battle of Antietam, emancipation did not mean equality right away. And so I share with you an interesting story about First Lieutenant Azor Nickerson, who carried with him on campaign, not literally, but figuratively, a servant of African American descent. He recalled his servant that day on September the 16th, a colored boy who rejoiced in the name of Joe White. He came very near turning white in person as in name, as more of those Confederate shells landed around the 8th Ohio. Nickerson recalled that Joe's expression and movements displayed a sense of fear and uncomfortableness as each new shell landed near them. As one shell screamed in, a soldier in the camp started to run across the open space that separated the battery from the infantry, striking him and, quote, taking off one of his feet above the ankle. The man was going so fast that he took 2 or 3 steps on the mangled stump before he fell. The scene made Joe even more pale. The rounds continued to fall among the regiment. One shell landed near the color guard, which had only recently stacked its muskets, placed the colors on the stack, and sipped on some freshly made coffee. Nickerson observed the shell's impact and believed that it had come from a 20-pound cannon, based on the size of the round and the destruction from its impact. Nickerson picks up the account. He said the shell had plunged into the ground in the middle of the group. The dust flew in a cloud as the men apparently jumped to their feet. Not all of them had survived. The dust settled from the shell's impact. And Nickerson, quote, saw that one man, the color corporal, named Farmer, had not arisen. Nickerson's not seen this man get up. Nickerson starts running towards him. By the time that he gets there, he notices that the shell had not exploded and was still laying near the man. And when he finally got close enough to the soldier that had not arisen, this man by the name of Farmer, he eventually kneeled next to him, and he raised him to examine his wounds. And he noticed at that point that the shell, quote, had torn away the man's whole side. He was dead almost as soon as I reached him. This scene triggered Nickerson's servant, Joe, even more. Nickerson said he looked whiter than ever. This was too much for Joe. So Joe ran to a pile of fence rails stacked nearby, jumped on the other side, and took cover. But it wasn't long before yet another Confederate shell fell into the ranks of the men of the 8th Ohio. This one hit the ground so hard that it glanced upwards, traveled a short distance, and took off the top of that stack of rails. The pile of rails exploded everywhere, and it brought, Nickerson recalled, quote, Joe to his feet, as white a looking Negro as was ever seen. Finding that he was not hurt, he started at full speed to the rear, and I saw him no more that night. It's an interesting perspective. Interesting perspective. The following morning, on September the 17th, the 8th Ohio would arrive on the battlefield between 8:45 and 9:15 a.m. Now, their initial goal that day, as part of the rest of their brigade, was to link up with a number of other Union soldiers and push westward towards an area around a church and some woods, known as the Dunker Church and the Westwoods, if you've been to Antietam. They were supposed to link up with a number of soldiers out of Sedgwick, John Sedgwick's command, but Sedgwick didn't wait for the 8th Ohio and that unit of men from the 2nd Corps, and they went on without him. And now this division of soldiers, including the 8th Ohio, under the command of French, had nowhere to go. And so French would turn his division and head southwards. And as the men marched southwards, they would begin to experience some fire from a Confederate position that occupied a sunken road, a lane, if you will. French would send his first 2 brigades in, both with limited success. His last brigade, which included the 8th Ohio, had been held in reserve, and it was time to send them in. The 8th Ohio's brigade commander, Nathaniel Kimball, would receive the orders to march his brigade southward to shore up the Union line. French's division, that was crumbling under the weight of Confederate fire coming out of this sunken lane. Nickerson recalled the moment of his unit, along with the rest of the brigade, Kimball's brigade. He said, quote, "We halted in an orchard while the other brigades were advanced to the crest of the line of little hills, which lay distinctly in front of and parallel with a deep ravine and a cornfield beyond. As soon as they reached the crest of these rises of ground, they were met by a tremendous volley from the enemy, posted in that ravine and a cornfield. They wavered for a few minutes, then breaking, came back at a bull run pace, threatening to overrun everything that stood in their way. Our line that stood fast, and by shouts of cowards and threats to charge bayonets on them if they did not halt, were checked." As Kimball's brigade with the 8th Ohio push forward, they will establish a new line closer to this ravine, this sunken lane, this low point of ground in which the Confederates were seeking cover. And for the next several moments, they will fight defensively, trading shots back and forth. As they do so, a Confederate counterattack would organize. They would come out of the lane itself and begin to close the gap between the lane and the Union position. But it was disjointed and ultimately had failed. But during this attack, General French would receive orders. Remember General Sedgwick that pushed forward over the West Woods and the Dunker Church without waiting for anybody? His line is under severe pressure. He needs help. And so the orders are for French's division to apply more pressure here, to relieve Sedgwick over here in the West Woods. Hopefully Confederates will be sent over here to relieve that pressure on Sedgwick. And so French, receiving those orders, renews the attack. The 8th Ohio and the rest of that line you see pictured there on the map charged forward. Nickerson, in command of Company I during the battle, recalled what happened next in a newspaper interview on September 22nd. After taking their position just south of the Roulette Farmyard, and there's the Roulette Farm right there, still standing on the Antietam National Battlefield today, They had taken that position by bayonet. Nickerson recalled what happened next. He said the enemy were strongly posted in front of a hill, drawn up in 2 lines of battle. The Ohio boys stood fully exposed to the enemy. We were exposed to a murderous fire, but not an Ohio man flinched. Little dig at the other units in the brigade not being from the state of Ohio. It's at this time that Azor Nickerson will become a casualty of the battle, receive a wound. And the rest of Nickerson's story tonight will serve as a representative example of the Ohioans that were wounded in combat. What was their treatment like after the battle? What was the conditions of the hospitals? What did wounded Ohioans experience in the wake of the Battle of Antietam? Nickerson remembered the bullet and the impact on him. He said, quote, "The sharp jab of the bullet, a blur about my eyes, and the warm blood running down my right side as that arm fell helpless. The bullet had struck him in the shoulder joint, traveled down the length of his arm, and exited out of the elbow." Nickerson immediately headed towards the rear, where his regiment had stacked their knapsacks before going into battle, to the roulette property, where a field hospital had been opened. When Nickerson arrived, he said, quote, "The sight was appalling. It seemed as though nearly the whole of my regiment was there. 3 of my lieutenant comrades with their eyes shot out, and poor Lieutenant Barnes with an awful wound in the head from which a portion of his brain protruded." The next day, when ambulances arrived to the roulette property, as Nickerson is there, they begin to put some of the wounded Ohioans on ambulances to get them out. Charles Barnes, that lieutenant with the severe head wound, stood up. Imagine 24 hours laying there with no medical help, with a wound where a portion of your brain is exposed. Barnes stands up, starts walking to one of the ambulances, and after 3 steps, collapses, dead. Nickerson decided not to stay at the roulette farm much longer. He looked for better care, more established field hospitals than this one at the roulette farm. He would head into the town of Keedysville nearby, and he would seek treatment at the Keedysville church. But the sight there was even more disturbing than what Nickerson had seen of his wounded Ohioans at the roulette farm. When he arrived at the church, he said, quote, "The wounded were lying in the little grove that partially surrounded the church, each poor wretch waiting his turn for examination. When my turn came, they took me up to a seat that stood facing the pulpit, but perpendicular to the others, and near which was an open window. As we walked up the aisle, we splashed along in the blood that had run down from the amputations that lay on boards placed on the pews on either side. The operating surgeons were in their shirt sleeves, which were rolled up, leaving their bare arms exposed and covered with blood, giving them the appearance of a bevy of butchers in a Chicago abattoir. While sitting awaiting the surgeon, every few minutes an attendant would bring past me to the open window an arm, a leg, or a mangled hand, which he pitched into a little trench dug under the window for the purpose." Between 1 and 2 p.m. on the afternoon of September 17th, the 8th Ohio was finally relieved from the front lines. Along with the rest of their brigade, they would withdraw, they would reform around those roulette farm buildings, barn and house. When Colonel Sawyer, the 8th Ohio, in command of the 8th at the Battle of Antietam, wrote the regimental history in 1881, he remembered the number of casualties the regiment had sustained as fearful. In all, he counted 162 officers and men having been killed or wounded, a number he believed that to be approximately half of what he took onto the battlefield that day. Private John A. Chichester of Company B would write on September 18th in his diary of the previous day's fighting. He said it had been one of the hardest fought battles of the war. The brigade fought splendidly. We have not disgraced Cleveland. I'm going to share with you one final story of an Ohioan at the Battle of Antietam tonight. Soldier that had originally joined the 23rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry would later be promoted to the level of brigade work, working in the quartermaster department of his brigade, Ewing's brigade, with the rank of commissary sergeant. His name, William McKinley, the only future president that would fight at the Battle of Antietam. Hayes was wounded at South Mountain, so he would not be at Antietam. Now, the 23rd Ohio would get up for the day on September 17th at 2 in the morning. 2 in the morning. No time to cook breakfast. Get your stuff together. We're moving out. We're going into position. As the men are marching, you eat what you have on the go. And you got that haversack where you put your rations in there. And as they're marching throughout the pre-dawn hours, they start reaching in their haversack for a piece of hardtack, piece of meat, anything. And many of them are coming up empty-handed. Their fighting experience just 3 days earlier, the rate of the campaign, supplies were coming up slowly. It was taking longer to get to the front. And by the time they go into position and they're waiting for orders to go into battle, a lot of these men hadn't eaten. By 2 p.m., 12 hours later, they are still in position waiting to go into battle. Many of them have still not eaten that day. Throughout those intervening hours, this commissary sergeant by the name of William McKinley believed that the men of his unit, the 23rd Ohio, must have been faint with hunger. And if that they were ordered into battle, they're not going to have a great performance. So he decides to do something about it. McKinley springs into action. 2 miles behind where the 23rd Ohio was in position was a wagon train full of commissary stores. McKinley goes back there. In the area of these stores, McKinley notices, quote, some stragglers. There was plenty of them while the fighting was raging. So I set them to work. McKinley commandeers these stragglers and says, listen, you're going to help me, or I'm going to send you back to your unit on the front lines. McKinley begins to have these men gather supplies, gather rations, prepare the rations. He's not going to take raw meat to the front line. There's no time to cook it. There's no campfires up there. He's going to have these men prepare the rations and then load them into a wagon. The men are preparing cooked meat, pork, beans, crackers, and a barrel of hot coffee. They would pile all of these rations into 2 wagons. But now McKinley has a problem. 1 McKinley, 2 wagons. How's he going to get them 2 miles back to the front line? So McKinley starts looking for volunteers in the area of these commissary supplies, and he comes across a man by the name of John Harvey of Company I, the 23rd Ohio. Harvey volunteered. I'll share with you Harvey's account of getting these supplies to the front line. And I pause before I tell you that story because I want to share with you that the mythology of what William McKinley did at Antietam is what? All he did was serve
Coffee.
That was it. That's all he did, right? Stood there, poured coffee in their canteens or in their cups. That's all he did. When you hear John Harvey's account of what McKinley went through to get those supplies to the men, I hope this evening it changes your perspective. Harvey wrote, quote, we started by the way of a by-road through a heavy piece of woods. After driving along the road for some distance from the camp, we met an army officer with his staff and told McKinley that he must not try to go to the regiment, as it would be impossible to run the blockade, as the rebel forces had command of an open strip of woods. The road beginning so narrow that we could not turn around, Sergeant McKinley thought we had better try to go on a little further. Before we came to the open space in the woods and close to the brow of the hill, we met another commanding officer who ordered us to immediately turn back. So McKinley has now violated orders twice. We stopped and considered the matter, and the officer and his bodyguard went in the opposite direction. This left Sergeant McKinley to decide what was best to do. The regiment was almost in sight of us, and Sergeant McKinley was so anxious to carry out his point and give the half-starved boys something to eat. He made one more appeal to me to run the blockade. He himself risking life in taking the lead. I followed and gathering the horses, we went at a full speed past the blockade. We had the back end of the wagon shot away by a small cannon shot. In a very few minutes, we were safe in the midst of a half-famished regiment. As McKinley reports to the new commander of the 23rd, Major James Conley, the men cheer and erupt up and down the line as the hot rations are being distributed. If McKinley had only served coffee that day, why do so many superior officers praise him and suggest him for further promotion? Major Conley of the 23rd wrote to Lieutenant Colonel Rutherford B. Hayes. The 23rd is continuing on with the campaign. Conley writes a letter to Hayes recovering in Middletown. Conley felt, quote, that McKinley showed ability and energy of the first class in not only keeping us fully supplied with rations throughout the fight, but in having them fully prepared for eating also. He delivered them to us under fire in 2 instances with perfect method and coolness. No promotion could be made which would give more general satisfaction. Not all the Ohioans that went into fight on September 17th would recover from their wounds. Some would perish in the days and weeks and months after. Some would be killed outright during the fighting. Tonight I'm going to share with you just the story of one soldier from the state of Ohio that's buried in the Ohio section of the National Cemetery at Antietam. His name's George Gentile. George Gentile was born in 1839 in Hancock County, Illinois. He enlisted in the 5th Ohio, Company E, in the wake of the attack on Fort Sumter in April of 1861, for 3 months' service. And so, by July of 1861, he's done his bit. He's served. But he doesn't end there. He immediately signs up for another 3-year enlistment. Re-enlists that same day into the same company, but because of his devotion to service, is promoted to corporal. The 5th Ohio would fight in and around the West Woods in the Dunker Church on September 17th, 1862, and it was there that Gentile was wounded by a gunshot wound through his right thigh. Assistant Surgeon J.H. Bill would later write of the wound, he said the ball entered to the outside of the right pyramidalis muscle, passed outward and downward in front of the femur, and emerged at a spot in the integument corresponding to the insertion in the gluteus maximus. A lot of medical talk that he had a gunshot wound to the hip that came out his butt. It's a pretty grievous wound. And if you look here on the top right of the screen, you're going to see that wound. Gentile's case of care after the Battle of Antietam was documented by his surgeons, and it was later included in the surgical and medical history of the American Civil War. This is a sketch of his wound after an autopsy was performed, giving the end of the story, if you will, up front. Now, Gentile is initially treated on the battlefield. Following his wounded, he'll later be transferred to a U.S. Army General Hospital in Frederick, Maryland, on October the 1st. When he finally gets to that more permanent, larger hospital in Frederick, the initial examination of his wound at the hospital in Frederick, his surgeon, Bill, noted that the injury was not of a grave character. Didn't even be suspected to be. But just 3 weeks later, Gentile's wound and his health would take a dramatic turn for the worse. Surgeon Bill would write in his case report of Gentile's treatment that on October 23rd, a hemorrhage from both wounds took place. He's bleeding profusely from the entrance wound and from the exit wound. Now, although the wound would be packed to stop the hemorrhage, no further treatment was given. That's all they did, just kept changing bandages. 2 days later, on October 25th, the hemorrhages returned. While working to stop it, surgeons noticed that his thigh and his hip were very swollen. Abscesses had formed, and there was even more hemorrhaging, as well as an ulceration of one of the blood vessels in the leg. Surgeon Bill immediately consulted another surgeon in the hospital. They talked about it, and this surgeon was a man by the name of H.S. Hewitt. And so the two surgeons suggested to Gentile at this point that a procedure needed to be done to correct some of these recent developments in his wound. Gentile says, "No. I've been through enough with this wound. I'm in a lot of pain and agony. Let's see if it corrects itself on its own." 4 days later, October 29th, hemorrhaging again, significantly. This time, Gentile calls the surgeons to his bedside, requests the surgery to tie off the artery in his leg. Although the surgeons were able to find and tie off that artery, they did not have time to find one of the other bleeding vessels, as, quote, at this stage of the operation, the shock to the patient was so severe that it was necessary to finish all operative interference as soon as possible. Gentile died 24 hours later. The surgeons would perform an autopsy, and you can see what they found of the abscess and the wound in the hip there. Following the autopsy, they suspected that the cause of death was that bleeding vessel that they could not track down, but during the autopsy they couldn't find it. But they felt that the course of action in which they had suggested 4 days earlier was the best course of action for Gentile, but unfortunately they were unable to save him. Today, Gentile rests in grave 1480 in the Antietam National Cemetery. And before I end the program tonight, I want to throw out a challenge, a research request for you folks here. I know many of you have a long history and study of the 8th Ohio Volunteer Infantry with their connections to Cleveland. There's a story about a 26-year-old man by the name of John Lantry. of the 8th Ohio. He'd been born in Ireland. Him and his family settled here in Cleveland. He is killed in action on September 17th. One of his brothers will travel to the battlefield, find his remains, and start heading back towards Cleveland. And around September 28th, he not only found John's body, but he already got it put into a coffin, got him on a train, and was stopped in Pittsburgh. And his brother James sends a telegram from Pittsburgh to his other brother Patrick in Cleveland and says, listen, I'm in Pittsburgh. I'm going to be home tomorrow. I'll be at this train station. I'll have John's body with me. Let's get the funeral arrangements taken care of. The telegram to Patrick would later appear on the September 29th edition of the Cleveland Daily Leader. John's remains would be back in Cleveland by 9:30 a.m. that morning, and, quote, a large number of friends of the deceased were at the depot to receive the remains. It would be the funeral the following day. It was really just an outpouring from the Cleveland community. Lantry had been a firefighter in the city. His firehouse would be draped in mourning for the next month following his death at Antietam. Now here is the thing that I need your help with. Lantry's story is much more detailed than that. You can find it in a great book I wrote over there on the table. But one of the things that I like to do when I research these things and I tell these stories is I like to go and visit these men. And although we know Lantry's remains returned back here to Cleveland, despite all of my research efforts, I can't find him or his family. It says he was buried somewhere in Cleveland. If you find out where he is, take one of my cards tonight. Let me know, because I'd like to go and pay respects to this brave Ohioan and his service to our country. I leave you tonight with what occurred in 1903 at Antietam. It's known as Ohio Day at Antietam. Ohio Day was going to be the day that all monuments to Ohio units that fought during the battle would have their monuments dedicated. A committee had been formed up in the fall of 1902 to get these monuments constructed, buy the property, get them placed. The ceremony itself would be originally scheduled for the anniversary of Antietam on September 17th, 1903, but the Monument Commission from Ohio, they were a little nervous. The contractors weren't replying quickly about the state of the monuments, if they were done yet, and New Jersey had already claimed that day to dedicate their monuments. So the Ohioans would push the date back to October the 13th, 1903. The main orator that day is this man pictured here on the right of the screen, General R.P. Kennedy. Kennedy would be a veteran of the American Civil War, a veteran of the Battle of Antietam, a native Ohioan that would go on to do many other things in service to his country. And tonight I'm going to share with you the importance that Kennedy stressed to remember the date of September 17th and those that participated in the battle and gave what Lincoln would later call their last full measure of devotion. But not only did he stress this in remembrance of all the Union soldiers that fought there, but more specifically, the Ohioans. And I share with you tonight the closing remarks of Kennedy's dedication speech of the Ohio monuments at Gettysburg. And I hope you will pick up Kennedy's charge that he gave to generations that never knew him. He said, "We must not forget the cost at which all of these glory and liberties have been purchased, nor the sacrifices necessary to win them. We must not forget the great leaders who here offered up their lives and the heroic men whose names are written in the record of their country's history. On this battlefield, Ohio found her place. We lift these monuments not alone to the dead, but to the living. They bear witness to coming generations of the valor of the fathers who preserve our institutions for the sons who were here to come after. What deeds of heroism were here enacted? Colonel Coleman of the 11th charging the bridge only to fall at the very moment of victory. Colonel Clark of the 36th leading his men across plowed fields and fallow in the grand charge only to fall in the front of rank in peril. It seems to be eminently proper that the state of Ohio should not only erect and dedicate monuments upon this field to commemorate the achievements of the regiments and the commands from that state, and so mark for all time the points where her sons did battle, but it is equally fitting that it should erect a monument to mark the spot or one of her younger soldiers in the performance of his duty contributed to the comfort and added to the strength and courage of that army. Their names will go down the centuries as the martyrs of the Republic. Thank you.
At this point, folks, are there any questions for Dan? We want to stump our first speaker, if possible.
Yes, sir.
At the beginning of your program, you talked about the money that Ohio spent and so on. And I'm just wondering if the soldiers from the various states got the same pay.
Right. So once the question is the Ohio soldiers that would serve, did they get the same amount of pay that other soldiers from Union states did? Yes, because they enter federal service. Even though they still have the state identity as being from Ohio, they're part of the federal army, as part of the federal government. Private's pay was $13 a month. Now, the only thing that they got a little additional were those bounties, if you will, that extra money to entice you to serve. It's one of the reasons why Ohio has such a small number of draftees, is because the bounties they put out were incredibly high compared to the other states. You could receive an additional $160, $180, $300 to sign up to serve. So you would get that money from the state of Ohio, and you would then get your monthly pay if you were a private, $13 in the rank, officers more as you went higher up the ranks, and then the medical staff even more than that. Yep. Good question. Yes, sir.
I believe it was the 8th Ohio that you mentioned about the unit history being written, maybe it sounded like almost 15 or 20 years later. Was that typical that it would take that long for the unit history to be written? And then also, was the person writing it typically commissioned to do so? Or is it something he just volunteered out of the kindness of his heart?
Right. So, well, what the question is basically asking is about regimental histories or unit histories. Most oftentimes it's regimental histories. It depends on the individual unit history. There are examples where even during the war itself, so for example, the 11th Ohio that fights at Antietam, after the Battle of Antietam, one of their soldiers writes a history of the 11th Ohio from 1861 to Fredericksburg and publishes it. After the war is over, you'll see veterans associations begin to form. Oftentimes, they'll function like a committee will or an executive board will, and they'll ask for volunteers or have someone on the executive board or committee write the official history. You will see unofficial regimental histories from men that served in that particular unit that wrote it from their perspective. In the case of the regimental history for the 8th Ohio, it was written by Franklin Sawyer, who was the lieutenant colonel of the 8th Ohio for the duration of the 8th Ohio's participation in the war. It did not start out as a regimental history for the 8th Ohio. It started out as Sawyer's perspective and experience in the 8th Ohio, but it has become the regimental history for the 8th Ohio because nothing else was ever written on the 8th Ohio. I do know of two folks in the greater surrounding Cleveland area that are working on newer regimental histories of the 8th that hopefully will be out in a couple years because Sawyer's regimental history is his account, his perspective. He very infrequently mentions anybody else in his account of what happens, particularly enlisted men. If he mentions anybody, it's officers. Good question. Yes, sir.
At the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that there was this difference of opinion in Ohio with regard to loyalty to the Union versus states' rights sort of thing.
Yeah.
I'm curious, do you know what the vote was in the Ohio legislature for and against Senator Harrison's
resolutions? I don't have those numbers off the top of my head. I can tell you that one of the houses, and I can't remember Senate or House right now, passed unanimously in honor or in support of his resolutions. The resolutions are fascinating. They are out there. There was a great book. One of the things that's not in my bio, I'm a huge bibliophile. My individual Civil War volumes are about 3,400 Plus I have all the big sets, official records, Confederate veteran. I have a very patient wife. But there was a document, just a little booklet that the state of Ohio published during the centennial in 1961 called Ohio Goes to War. And there's all these little tiny vignettes of experiences of Ohioans and the state of Ohio. And one of the chapters, and we're talking, this thing's maybe 30 pages in length, but one of the chapters is the transcripts of the resolution and how everyone voted. And so you can read line by line, and the resolutions are huge. I mean, there's got to be 50 or 60 resolutions that they pass. Most of it pertaining to the position of the state in response to South Carolina, but there's some other stuff thrown in there, as there's always pork in any legislation, state or federal. Nothing's changed since the creation of our government. Any other questions? Let's go with this young man back here.
Yeah, thank you for the great presentation. I just wanted to ask a question more of a personal nature.
Yep.
Why did you select Antietam to focus for the Ohio troops? Are there any plans for Ohio at Shiloh or Ohio at Gettysburg down the road?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the book that I published is through a publisher known as the History Press. And over the last year, they've kind of started an unofficial series of if you will. And being a bibliophile, I can tell you every new and used bookstore between here and North Carolina. And I got tired of going in there and seeing at these bookstores, New Hampshire at Antietam, Connecticut at Antietam, all these small little New England states. And I said, well, by golly, I'm a native Ohioan and proud of being a Buckeye, and I want to see the stories of Ohioans at Antietam. So that was one of the impetus of it. But I think what's really in a larger sense is that Ohio at Antietam, this battle is so pivotal in this moment in American history, not only because of the casualties that the Ohioans and both armies faced as a result of this battle, but the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation comes out of this, which goes into effect in January of 1863. And it's such a pivotal moment that knowing what our native states soldiers did for our country and for our state, I felt was a story that needed to be told. Particularly, I mean, come on, we give the United States two presidents that fight in this campaign. So hearing those stories and making sure they're not lost was a larger objective of the book. Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with the cemeteries on Woodland Avenue in Cleveland?
I am.
There's one on both sides of the street.
Yes.
The one that's south, has a number of 8th Ohio, buried in there. And maybe that land might be there.
I hope so. I've looked through the burial lists of what's been published that's in that cemetery. There are no servicemen with the last name of Lantry in there. There are a couple of Lantrys there in that cemetery. None of them are any of his brothers' names or parents' names, and all of them are born. There are a couple John Lantrys, believe it or not, in there, but they are born in the 1860s, so the dates are all off. But I do appreciate that tip. I need to go out and do a physical inspection. All I've done is pulled the lists of people buried there. Yep.
Also, after the Battle of Antietam, the brigade that 8th Ohio was part of was called the Gibraltar Brigade.
Correct.
There's some question as to who actually called them the Gibraltar Brigade, whether French did or who might have done that. Do you have anything on that?
There are a couple different accounts of who and when the nickname of the Gibraltar Brigade is used. We know for sure that official reports are referring to them as the Gibraltar Brigade by the Gettysburg Campaign in June and July of 1863. I don't have any insight onto or opinion as to who is credited or when they start using it specifically. But to my knowledge, pre-June of 1863, there are no primary sources that say Gibraltar Brigade. So no one in the brigade or in the Ohio units in particular are writing with my brigade, the Gibraltar Brigade, or the Gibraltar Brigade did well, or no diary entries, no journal entries, no official reports that refer to them until the Gettysburg Campaign. So although they could have been already have received that nomenclature, that nom de guerre, hard to say when and who. Yeah, it's a great question though.
Okay, last question. Paul?
Did Nickerson survive his Antietam wounds?
Yes.
Did he survive the war?
He does survive the war. So the image you saw of him is the only known image of him. He does survive the war. He will go on and continue to serve. He re-enlists in March 8th of 1865 for another 3-year hitch in the 196th Ohio, and he continues on with a military life after that. He'll rise through the ranks. He'll eventually retire as a brevetted major general, and he's buried in Arlington National Cemetery.
One exception, Mike.
I just want to ask, I looked at the books up here, and I noticed the two attractive hardbacks talk about and I've seen this term before, the emergent Civil War. What is the philosophy of the emergent Civil War?
Yeah, so Emerging Civil War, we're a cadre of public historians. So we don't sit in our ivory tower, and we don't write books that no one will read about minute, little topics of, so-and-so's underdrawers during the American Civil War. And, one of the real newest ones I love is An Environmental History of the American Civil War. It's a $65 hardcover book to talk about the effects that the Civil War created in pollution on our country during the American Civil War. So we're a cadre of public historians. So we are folks that basically work, whether it be in writing or working at battlefields or historic sites. We're on the front lines of history. We see it as our jobs to make sure that these stories, these moments in American history, these very pivotal moments, are not forgotten by future generations, that we are constantly researching, bringing new stories to light, telling stories, researching images, finding things that haven't been talked about before in the last 150 years. So our philosophy is to bring all of that stuff to an engaging level, to not only satisfy our appetites, as you all sit here tonight, to continue to read and learn and love this part of American history, but also to get that next generation inspired. And to encourage them that, like tonight, if they came and saw this talk about Ohioans at Antietam, my goal is, if I did my job right, I've inspired them to go to Antietam and to see where these stories came from.
Okay, if you have other questions, please talk to Dan after we're done. And now it's time for, applause.
Thank you.